How did my daughter's preschool graduation turn into a hostage negotiation in 45 minutes? The auditorium at Sunshine Valley Preschool smelled like crayons and fresh paint, and my daughter Emma sat in the front row wearing her tiny blue graduation cap while I stood along the back wall with 40 other parents, all of us holding phones ready to capture the moment our 4-year-olds received their certificates. Director Rebecca Thornton stood at the podium adjusting the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, which I noticed because I'd been watching her closely for the past week after my ex-wife mentioned something felt off about Emma's teacher conferences. The other parents chatted quietly and adjusted their cameras, oblivious to the tension radiating from Rebecca's forced smile as she welcomed everyone to the ceremony. My stomach tightened when I saw her glance toward the back exit, where 2 maintenance workers I'd never seen before stood blocking the doors with their arms crossed. Emma waved at me from her seat, and I waved back, trying to ignore the wrongness spreading through the room. Rebecca began her opening remarks about the journey these children had taken, but her voice cracked on every third word and sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. I pulled out my phone to text my ex-wife Diane about the weird maintenance guys, but before I could type anything, Rebecca's hand shot to her jacket pocket, and she pulled out a small black object that made my blood freeze. A remote control device with a red button under her thumb. She cleared her throat and said in a voice that had gone completely flat and cold, "I need everyone to remain very calm and listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because the safety of your children depends entirely on your cooperation for the next several hours." The auditorium went silent, except for one parent's nervous laugh that died quickly when Rebecca pressed the remote button, and we all heard the heavy metallic clank of automated locks engaging on every door simultaneously. She'd planned this, installed electronic locks that could seal the building from a single remote trigger, and we'd all walked our children directly into her trap without noticing. Parents started shouting questions and moving toward their kids, but the 2 maintenance workers pulled out tasers and told everyone to stay exactly where they were standing, or the first person who disobeyed would be dropped in front of their child. Rebecca's face had transformed from the warm preschool director who'd hugged Emma every morning into something cold and desperate. And when she spoke again, her words came out rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech 100 times. 10 years ago, the school board fired me from my position as elementary school principal after parents complained that I was too strict with discipline procedures. They destroyed my career over nothing, overdoing my job, and I lost my pension and my reputation and my marriage because of their cowardice and their spoiled children who couldn't handle basic rules. She gestured to the small children sitting in front of her, oblivious to the danger, still thinking this was part of their graduation program. These children represent everything wrong with modern parenting and education, the entitled next generation being raised to believe they deserve success without effort. But today, they're going to learn a very different lesson about consequences and accountability. I felt my legs go weak as I realized Rebecca had brought us here specifically to prove some twisted point about discipline and punishment, using 4-year-olds as hostages to fight a decade-old grievance that had clearly broken something fundamental in her mind. One parent tried to rush toward the children anyway, and the maintenance worker dropped him with the taser immediately, his body convulsing on the floor while his wife screamed and their son cried in his seat. Rebecca watched this with no emotion and said that was what happened when people didn't listen to instructions. Then she told everyone to move to the right side of the auditorium and sit on the floor with their hands visible at all times. We complied because what choice did we have with our children 15 feet away and tasers pointed at anyone who resisted? I sat down next to a father whose phone was still recording video in his hand, and Rebecca noticed immediately and told him to slide it across the floor toward her, or she'd have the maintenance workers tase his daughter next. He threw the phone so hard it skidded all the way to Rebecca's feet, and she crushed it under her heel without breaking eye contact with him. She instructed everyone to remove their phones and smartwatches and place them in a pile in front of us, and one by one we created a small mountain of devices that represented our only connection to outside help. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Diane as I set it down, probably wondering why I hadn't texted her back, and I watched the screen go dark, knowing she'd have no idea what was happening in this sealed building. Rebecca collected the remote devices from the maintenance workers and held up all 3, explaining that she had triggers for the doors, the building's fire suppression system that would release chemical suppressant throughout the ventilation if she pressed a certain sequence, and a third device that would activate a recorded message she'd programmed into the school's emergency alert system. She demonstrated the third device, and suddenly a loud alarm blared throughout the building, followed by Rebecca's recorded voice, explaining that an active shooter situation was in progress and all staff should initiate lockdown procedures immediately. The children in the front row started crying at the alarm sound, and Emma stood up trying to find me in the crowd of seated parents. I half rose to go to her, but one of the workers aimed his taser directly at my chest and told me to sit back down or he'd make my daughter watch me convulse on the floor. Emma called out "Daddy" in this small, scared voice that broke my heart, and I had to tell her everything was okay and she needed to stay in her seat and be brave for me. She sat back down, still crying, and I could see other children doing the same, confused and frightened by the sudden change from happy graduation to screaming adults and locked doors. Rebecca waited for the alarm to stop, then explained her demands in methodical detail that showed months of planning. She wanted the 3 school board members who'd voted to fire her brought to the building within 2 hours. She wanted a public written apology acknowledging they'd destroyed her life unjustly, and she wanted full reinstatement to her previous position with back pay for 10 years. If her demands weren't met by the deadline, she'd release the fire suppressant chemical throughout the building, which she claimed would render everyone unconscious within minutes and cause permanent respiratory damage to the children's developing lungs. She showed us a small gas mask hanging from her belt and said she'd be the only person protected when the chemical deployed, and we'd all wake up in hospitals with children who might never breathe properly again. The maintenance worker on the left, who had a military tattoo on his forearm, added that they'd tested the system last week to make sure it worked properly, and Rebecca had paid them $30,000 each to help with today's operation. Money she'd saved over 10 years of working shitty preschool jobs while planning her revenge against the people who'd ruined her career. I tried to think of anything I could do to stop this, any way to reach Emma or overpower Rebecca before she could trigger the chemical release. But she'd positioned herself perfectly with clear sight lines to all the parents and to the children. The maintenance workers stood on opposite sides of the room, creating crossfire zones that made rushing either of them impossible without getting tased or giving Rebecca time to press her button. My mind raced through terrible scenarios of what that chemical suppressant would do to Emma's small lungs, whether she'd recover fully or be damaged permanently, and rage built in my chest at the thought that this woman was willing to hurt innocent children to settle a grudge against people who weren't even in the room. Another parent asked if we could at least give the children water since they were scared and some were crying, and Rebecca considered this for a moment before agreeing, instructing the maintenance worker on the right to distribute the small juice boxes that were supposed to be part of the graduation celebration. He moved down the row of children handing out juice boxes with his taser visible in his other hand, a surreal image of refreshments served under threat of violence. Emma took her juice box with shaking hands, and I watched her drink it, grateful for even that small comfort. Outside the building, I could hear the first distant sounds of sirens approaching, meaning someone in the surrounding offices must have heard the screaming or seen something wrong through the windows. Rebecca heard the sirens too and smiled this satisfied smile, saying that was right on schedule. She'd expected someone to call police within 10 minutes, and now the real negotiation could begin. The sirens multiplied over the next 5 minutes until it sounded like every police car in the county had surrounded the building, and Rebecca walked to the window to look out at the gathering response. She narrated what she saw with clinical detachment, describing the SWAT vehicles taking positions behind barriers and officers in tactical gear moving through the parking lot. One of the parents asked if she really thought the police would bring the school board members to negotiate with a terrorist, and Rebecca spun around with this wild anger in her eyes and said she wasn't a terrorist. She was a victim seeking accountability from the people who'd destroyed her life without consequences. The distinction seemed very important to her, and I filed that away as potentially useful information for understanding her psychology if I got a chance to talk her down. A phone rang from somewhere in Rebecca's jacket, and she pulled out a cell phone that I realized was probably a burner purchased specifically for this event. She answered with a professional tone that was chilling in its normalcy, saying, "This is Rebecca Thornton, and I'm currently in control of 43 children between the ages of 4 and 5, along with their parents and 3 staff members. I have specific demands that need to be met within the next hour and 45 minutes, or I will release a chemical agent throughout this building that will cause permanent harm to everyone inside." She listened to whatever the police negotiator was saying, then interrupted with cold precision. "I don't want to hear about how you need time to assess the situation or verify my capabilities. The building is sealed with commercial-grade electronic locks on a closed-circuit system. I have visual confirmation of your positioning through multiple windows, and if any of your tactical teams attempt to breach doors or windows, I will immediately trigger the chemical release, and you'll have 43 dead or permanently disabled children on your conscience." The way she said it made me believe she'd actually do it, and apparently the negotiator believed it too, because Rebecca's expression shifted to satisfaction as she listened to their revised approach. She gave them her list of demands, then added that she wanted all media present to record the school board members' arrival and apology, because this wasn't just about her personal vindication, but about exposing the corrupt system that protected administrators who fired good educators for political reasons. She ended the call and turned back to face us, saying the next hour would determine whether this ended peacefully or whether we all became casualties of a broken system that valued appearances over accountability. I raised my hand slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might trigger a violent response, and when Rebecca nodded at me, I asked if I could explain to my daughter what was happening because she was crying and didn't understand why I couldn't come sit with her. Rebecca thought about this for a long moment, then said I could move to the front row near Emma, but I had to stay seated in the parents' section, not in the children's row, and if I tried anything stupid, she'd have the maintenance worker tase me in front of Emma to teach her about the consequences of disobedience. I agreed to her terms and slowly stood up, walking forward with my hands visible until I reached the front row where I could sit, directly behind Emma's chair. She turned around immediately and reached for me through the gap between seatbacks, and I held her small hand while telling her everything would be okay, that some people were confused right now, but the police outside were going to fix it. She asked why the mean lady had locked the doors, and I had to choose between lying to protect her innocence or being honest about the danger, and I chose honesty because I needed her to understand that she had to stay very quiet and do exactly what I said if I told her to do something. I whispered that the lady was angry about something that happened a long time ago, and she thought this was the way to fix it. But she was wrong, and soon the police would help everyone go home safely. Emma nodded with 4-year-old trust that adults could solve any problem, and I felt the weight of that trust pressing on my chest, knowing I might not be able to protect her if Rebecca decided to release the chemical. Looking at the other children in the row, I saw similar fear and confusion on their small faces, and rage built in my chest at Rebecca for traumatizing these kids to satisfy her decade-old vendetta. One child, a little boy with glasses in the third seat from the left, wet himself from fear and started crying with shame, and his mother in the back row was crying too, unable to reach him. Rebecca noticed the boy and told one of the maintenance workers to take him to the bathroom, which seemed like a momentary kindness, until she added that his mother would stay seated, and if the boy tried to run or signal for help through the bathroom window, his mother would be tased until she was unconscious. The maintenance worker led the sobbing child out of the auditorium, and Rebecca checked her watch, noting that 40 minutes had passed since she'd sealed the building, and police had 1 hour and 5 minutes remaining to meet her demands. She addressed the room, explaining that she'd spent 10 years planning this moment, studying hostage negotiations and police response protocols, identifying the perfect location with the ideal combination of victim sympathy and media attention potential. Preschool graduations created maximum emotional impact because the children were old enough to remember the trauma, but young enough to be permanently damaged by chemical exposure, and the presence of parents meant adult witnesses who could testify to the school board's failures if given the opportunity. The calculated nature of her planning horrified me more than the immediate threats, because it meant she'd thought through every consequence and decided the damage to these children was acceptable collateral in her quest for revenge. Rebecca continued her explanation, describing how she'd researched commercial fire suppression systems and found one that used a chemical compound called FM200 that displaced oxygen rapidly and caused unconsciousness, followed by potential brain damage, if exposure lasted more than 3 minutes. She'd had the system installed 6 months ago under the guise of updated safety regulations, paying for it from her personal savings and forging approval documents from the fire marshal. The installation company had no idea they were creating a weapon for her hostage plan. They thought they were upgrading an outdated system to protect children more effectively. The irony of using a safety system as a threat wasn't lost on Rebecca, who smiled when explaining how the fire marshal would eventually figure out the fake approval documents, but by then it would be too late to matter. She'd also researched the psychological profiles of school board members and knew that Margaret Willis, the board president who'd led the vote to fire her, had lost a grandchild to accidental suffocation 5 years ago and would be psychologically vulnerable to threats involving children's breathing. That was why Rebecca had specifically chosen a chemical suppressant system rather than any other type of threat, because she knew Margaret would be haunted by the possibility of causing more children to die from respiratory failure and would pressure the other board members to comply immediately with demands. The depth of psychological manipulation in Rebecca's planning made me realize we were dealing with someone who'd spent a decade becoming an expert in inflicting maximum trauma. The little boy returned from the bathroom wearing different pants that one of the workers must have found in the lost and found box, and he ran back to his seat without looking at anyone. Rebecca received another call from the negotiator and listened for a moment before interrupting to say she didn't care about their concerns about setting dangerous precedents or encouraging copycat situations. She said the school board had set a dangerous precedent 10 years ago by firing an effective administrator to appease parents who didn't like discipline, and now they'd learn what happened when you destroyed someone's life without considering the consequences. The negotiator apparently offered something because Rebecca's expression shifted to interest, and she asked for clarification before responding. "You're telling me that Margaret Willis is refusing to come to the building because her therapist advised against it due to her trauma history? That's unfortunate, but not my problem. She has 55 minutes to arrive with a written apology and full reinstatement offer, or I start the countdown to chemical release." She ended the call and told us that Margaret was trying to avoid accountability again, hiding behind therapy and trauma instead of taking responsibility for her actions. Several parents started crying, and one father stood up shouting that Rebecca was insane and needed to let the children go before she made everything worse. The maintenance worker tased him immediately, and his body hit the floor hard, his head making a sickening crack against the tile. His daughter in the front row screamed, "Daddy," and tried to run to him, but the other maintenance worker blocked her path and forced her back into her seat. The father's wife crawled over to him and checked his breathing, confirming he was alive but unconscious, and she glared at Rebecca with pure hatred. Rebecca showed no remorse about the violence, just noted that we now had 53 minutes remaining and any further disruptions would result in immediate tasing. I held Emma's hand tighter and told her not to look at the man on the floor, to keep her eyes on me and remember that I loved her and we'd get through this together. She nodded, but I could see the trauma forming in her eyes, the innocence being stripped away by witnessing adults hurt each other while authority figures did nothing to stop it. The phone rang again, and Rebecca answered with increasing irritation, and this time the conversation lasted longer, with her responding to multiple points the negotiator raised. She finally said that she'd accept a video call with Margaret Willis as a preliminary step, but if Margaret didn't agree to come in person within 30 minutes after the call, the deadline remained firm. She hung up and told everyone that we were about to witness accountability in action, that Margaret would finally have to face the consequences of her decision to destroy Rebecca's career. A laptop computer appeared in the hands of one maintenance worker, and he set it up on a small table at the front of the auditorium. Rebecca positioned herself in front of the camera and told everyone to remain silent during the call, or she'd gag anyone who made noise. The video call connected, and suddenly Margaret Willis appeared on the screen, a woman in her late 60s with gray hair and red eyes that suggested she'd been crying. Rebecca's face transformed into this satisfied smile, and she said, "Hello, Margaret. It's been 10 years since you destroyed my life. Thank you for finally taking the time to speak with me." Margaret's voice came through the laptop speakers shaky and scared, asking Rebecca to please let the children go and they could discuss whatever issues remained between them. Rebecca laughed and said the issues were quite simple. Margaret had voted to fire her based on complaints from 3 parents who didn't like Rebecca's enforcement of homework policies and dress code requirements. Those 3 parents had campaigned against her, spread lies about her being abusive and rigid, and Margaret had caved to public pressure instead of supporting an administrator who was trying to maintain educational standards. Margaret tried to defend her decision, by saying there had been multiple complaints over several years, and the school board had to consider the concerns of the parent community. Rebecca interrupted with cold fury, explaining that all the complaints came from parents whose children were failing because they weren't completing assignments, and instead of holding students accountable, Margaret's board had blamed the administrator who expected basic effort. She described how she'd lost her marriage within a year of being fired because her husband couldn't handle the shame and financial stress, how she'd been rejected from every administrative position she applied for because Margaret's board had shared negative references, and how she'd been forced to take entry-level preschool jobs that paid a third of her previous salary. The 10 years of humiliation and struggle had taught her that the system didn't care about effective educators, only about appeasing whoever complained the loudest, and today she was going to force the system to finally acknowledge its failures. Margaret was crying on screen now, apologizing repeatedly, and saying she hadn't known the firing would affect Rebecca so severely. Rebecca's response was vicious, saying ignorance of consequences didn't absolve responsibility, and Margaret's comfortable retirement with full pension while Rebecca struggled. In poverty was exactly the kind of inequality this action was meant to expose. I watched Emma watching the laptop screen, not understanding the adult conflict, but absorbing the anger and fear in Rebecca's voice. Her small hand squeezed mine, and I whispered that everything would be okay, but I didn't know if I believed it anymore. Rebecca demanded that Margaret come to the building in person with the other 2 board members who'd voted for her termination, and Margaret said she'd come alone because the other 2 board members had moved out of state years ago. Rebecca accepted this, but insisted on the written apology and reinstatement offer with full back pay, and Margaret agreed through tears to have the documents prepared. The call ended, and Rebecca checked her watch, announcing that Margaret had 25 minutes to arrive with proper documentation, or the chemical release would proceed on schedule. The maintenance workers looked nervous for the first time, and I realized they might be having second thoughts about participating in mass child endangerment. The one with the military tattoo asked Rebecca if she was really going to hurt the kids, or if this was just a threat to get Margaret here, and Rebecca's response was chilling in its honesty. She said that depended entirely on whether Margaret and the police took her seriously, but she'd rather follow through with chemical release than be dismissed and ignored again after everything she'd planned. The maintenance worker didn't look satisfied with that answer and glanced at his partner with an expression that suggested communication was happening silently between them. I filed that away as potential opportunity if they decided to turn on Rebecca, though with tasers in their hands and 43 children in the line of fire, any uprising would need to be perfectly coordinated. Rebecca's phone rang again and she answered with irritation, listening briefly before saying, "I don't care if Margaret is having a panic attack in the parking lot. She has 20 minutes to walk through that door with signed documents, or I start pumping FM 200 through the ventilation system." She hung up and paced across the front of the auditorium with this manic energy that suggested she was reaching a breaking point where rational decisions might give way to violent impulses. One of the preschool teachers, Mrs. Patterson, had been sitting quietly with the children the entire time, but now she stood up slowly with her hands visible and asked Rebecca to consider that harming children would destroy any possibility of redemption or vindication she hoped to achieve. Rebecca turned on her with fury, saying she didn't want redemption, she wanted acknowledgement of injustice and punishment for the people who'd caused it. Mrs. Patterson pressed further, explaining that the children had nothing to do with the school board's decision, and using them as leverage only proved that Rebecca had become exactly the kind of person who'd abuse authority over vulnerable people. That argument struck something in Rebecca's psychology, and her face went blank, processing the comparison between her actions and the accusations that had led to her firing. For a moment, I thought Mrs. Patterson might have broken through to whatever rational thinking remained in Rebecca's mind, but then Rebecca's expression hardened, and she told Mrs. Patterson to sit down and shut up, or she'd be tased like the father still unconscious on the floor. Mrs. Patterson sat down but maintained eye contact with Rebecca, clearly trying to use psychological pressure to undermine her resolve. The maintenance worker with the military tattoo's phone buzzed, and he looked at the screen, then showed it to his partner without letting Rebecca see. Some communication was happening that Rebecca wasn't controlling, and I wondered if police had made contact with them or if they were having second thoughts about the money being worth potential murder charges. Rebecca noticed them looking at each other and demanded to know what they were discussing. And the military tattoo guy said his contact outside had confirmed that Margaret was walking toward the building now with documents in hand. Rebecca moved to the window and looked out, confirming that a woman matching Margaret's description was approaching the main entrance accompanied by 2 police officers. She told the maintenance workers to meet Margaret at the door, verify the documents were complete, and then bring her inside to the auditorium. They nodded and moved toward the exit, and I noticed they left their tasers on a table near the door rather than taking them. That seemed significant, a signal that they might be preparing to abandon Rebecca's plan. She noticed too and called them back, demanding they take their weapons. The military tattoo guy said they didn't need weapons for escorting a 68-year-old woman, and that seemed to satisfy Rebecca enough that she allowed them to leave without the tasers. That left only Rebecca with her remote controls and us with no immediate physical threat except for whatever those remotes could trigger. I assessed the distance between my position in the front row and where Rebecca stood by the window, calculating whether I could reach her before she pressed the chemical release button. The answer was almost certainly no, but if she was distracted when Margaret entered, there might be a moment of opportunity. I caught Mrs. Patterson's eye and tilted my head slightly toward Rebecca, trying to communicate without words that we might need to coordinate an action. She gave a tiny nod that suggested she understood. Emma noticed the silent exchange and whispered, "Daddy, what are you doing?" And I told her I was just stretching my neck because I'd been sitting for a long time. She accepted this, but looked worried, and I hated that my 4-year-old daughter had to be worried about her father's behavior because she'd learned that unexpected actions resulted in people being hurt. The auditorium doors opened, and the maintenance workers returned with Margaret Willis walking between them. She looked older in person than she had on video, her face drawn and pale with fear. Rebecca told Margaret to stand in the center of the auditorium where everyone could see her, and Margaret complied while clutching a folder of documents against her chest. Rebecca made her wait in silence for a full minute, just standing there while all the parents and children watched before finally speaking. "Margaret, you're going to read your written apology out loud so that everyone in this room can hear you acknowledge the injustice you committed. Then, you're going to sign the reinstatement documents and authorize the back pay transfer while these people witness your accountability. And if you hesitate or refuse any part of this process, I will press this button and everyone in this room will suffer permanent consequences because of your failure to act." Margaret opened the folder with shaking hands and began reading from a document that had clearly been written by lawyers rather than from genuine remorse. She apologized for the school board's decision to terminate Rebecca's employment without fully investigating the complaints or considering Rebecca's perspective. She acknowledged that the termination had caused Rebecca financial and emotional hardship that the board hadn't adequately considered. She committed to reviewing personnel decisions with greater care in future situations. The apology was corporate and hollow, the kind of statement meant to minimize legal liability rather than accept moral responsibility, and Rebecca's face showed her recognition of this. She interrupted Margaret mid-sentence and said, "Stop reading what the lawyers wrote. I want you to say in your own words what you did to me and why it was wrong." Margaret looked terrified but tried to comply, speaking slowly. "Rebecca, I'm sorry that our decision to end your employment caused you such difficulty. At the time, we believed we were acting in the best interests of the students and parents who had expressed concerns about discipline procedures." Rebecca's expression went from cold to enraged, and she raised the remote control with her thumb over the button. "That's not an apology, that's another excuse. You're standing here with 43 children about to be poisoned, and you still can't admit you were wrong." Margaret broke down completely then, sobbing and saying, "Yes, we were wrong. I was wrong. I should have supported you instead of listening to parents who just wanted their children to coast through school without effort. I destroyed your career because I was scared of bad publicity, and I've thought about that decision every day for 10 years, but was too cowardly to reach out and apologize. You deserved better from us and from me, and I'm sorry for being weak when you needed support." The words came out raw and genuine, stripped of legal protection, just an old woman admitting her failures. Rebecca's hand trembled over the button but didn't press it, and I realized this moment was the tipping point where she'd either accept the apology and stand down or reject it and follow through with her threat. The maintenance workers had moved to positions near the exits, clearly ready to intervene if Rebecca pressed the button, and I prepared to launch myself toward her if she showed any sign of triggering the chemical release. Margaret continued talking, saying she couldn't undo the past 10 years, but she'd signed reinstatement documents that would give Rebecca her full pension and back pay, and she'd personally ensure that Rebecca's employment record was corrected to show she'd resigned voluntarily rather than being terminated. It wasn't justice, and it wasn't enough, but it was something, and Margaret was offering it with genuine remorse written across her face. Rebecca lowered the remote slightly, and I saw tears forming in her eyes, the armor of rage cracking to reveal the wounded person underneath. She said, "It's too late, Margaret. Even with reinstatement, I've lost 10 years I can't get back. My husband is gone. My reputation is destroyed. And nothing you sign today will change the fact that you valued appearances over truth." Mrs. Patterson stood up again and spoke directly to Rebecca, saying, "You're right that Margaret can't give you back those 10 years, but you can choose not to lose the next 30 years in prison for hurting children who had nothing to do with your firing. You've made your point, you've gotten your apology, and now you can end this before it becomes something you can never take back." Rebecca looked at Mrs. Patterson with this expression of someone considering surrender, and then she looked at the children sitting in their graduation seats, finally seeming to see them as actual children rather than as leverage. Her hand opened, and the remote control fell to the floor, and the maintenance worker with the military tattoo immediately kicked it away before Rebecca could change her mind. The other maintenance worker moved to grab the second remote from Rebecca's jacket, but she handed it over voluntarily, saying, "I just wanted someone to acknowledge what they did to me. That's all I ever wanted." The police burst through the doors immediately. They'd apparently been monitoring the situation through some feed and had been waiting for the moment Rebecca surrendered control. Tactical officers swarmed into the auditorium with weapons drawn and ordered everyone to stay seated while they secured the room. Rebecca was pulled to the ground and handcuffed while she cried, not resisting, just repeating, "I just wanted acknowledgement," over and over. The children started crying at the sudden influx of armed officers, and parents rushed forward to grab their kids, despite police orders to stay in place. I pulled Emma into my arms and held her while she sobbed into my shoulder, her small body shaking with delayed shock. Around us, other parents were doing the same, creating a scene of desperate relief and residual terror as everyone tried to process what had just happened. The police evacuated us from the building immediately, concerned that Rebecca might have had backup plans or that the chemical system could be triggered remotely by a timer she'd set. We flooded into the parking lot where ambulances waited to assess everyone for injuries or stress reactions. Emma clung to me and wouldn't let go even when paramedics tried to check her vitals, so they examined her while she sat in my lap. They said her heart rate was elevated and she was showing signs of acute stress, but was physically unharmed. Diane arrived within minutes, having been notified by police when the hostage situation became public, and she ran to us crying and trying to hold both Emma and me while asking what happened. I gave her the abbreviated version while Emma transferred from my arms to hers, and Diane's expression shifted from relief to fury as she realized the preschool director had deliberately traumatized our daughter for a personal vendetta. Police separated all the parents for individual interviews, and I spent 2 hours describing every detail I could remember from the moment Rebecca revealed her plan to the moment she surrendered. The detective taking my statement asked specifically about the maintenance workers and whether they'd seemed like willing participants or coerced accomplices, and I told him about their nervous behavior and the moment they'd left the tasers behind when escorting Margaret inside. He wrote everything down and said those details would be important for determining charges. Emma stayed with Diane in the family reunification area while I gave my statement, and when I finally got back to them, Emma was asleep in Diane's arms with this exhausted expression that made her look younger than 4. Diane said Emma had asked repeatedly why the mean lady wanted to hurt everyone, and Diane hadn't known how to answer that in a way a 4-year-old could understand. The investigation moved rapidly over the following week, with police discovering that Rebecca had indeed planned every detail meticulously. They found journals in her apartment documenting her research into hostage negotiations, floor plans of the preschool with exit points marked, and drafts of her demands refined over months. The maintenance workers turned state's evidence immediately, explaining that Rebecca had recruited them through online forums where disgruntled military veterans discussed their struggles with civilian employment. She'd offered them $30,000 each to participate in what she described as a leverage action to force school board accountability, downplaying the danger to children and emphasizing her moral justification. They'd believed her at first, but began having second thoughts when they saw how terrified the children were, which was why they'd coordinated with police during the final 30 minutes to ensure Rebecca couldn't trigger the chemical release if she changed her mind about surrendering. Their cooperation resulted in reduced charges of conspiracy and false imprisonment, rather than kidnapping and attempted murder. Rebecca's psychological evaluation showed a complex trauma response to her job loss, combined with obsessive personality traits that had focused all her pain and rage on Margaret Willis as the symbol of everything wrong with her life. The psychologist noted that Rebecca had no criminal history or history of violence before the hostage situation, suggesting her actions were an aberration driven by a decade of compounding stress rather than inherent criminality. The prosecutor argued that careful planning over months proved premeditation and criminal intent rather than spontaneous breakdown, and the judge agreed, denying Rebecca bail and scheduling her trial for 6 months later. Margaret Willis testified at the preliminary hearing, providing details about Rebecca's employment termination and acknowledging that the school board's decision had been influenced more by parent pressure than by objective evaluation of Rebecca's performance. She maintained that she'd genuinely forgotten about Rebecca over the intervening years until the hostage situation forced her to confront the consequences of that administrative decision. Emma started having nightmares within days of the graduation incident, waking up screaming about mean ladies and locked doors and chemicals. Diane and I took her to a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and the doctor explained that 4-year-olds process traumatic events differently than adults, often through play reenactment and repetitive questions. Emma started playing hostage game with her dolls, which the psychologist said was healthy processing. But watching my daughter recreate her trauma with toys made me want to find Rebecca and hurt her in ways that would violate my own moral code. The psychologist recommended intensive play therapy twice a week and warned us that Emma might develop trust issues with teachers and authority figures that could affect her education for years. Diane and I attended parallel therapy sessions to learn how to support Emma while processing our own trauma responses, and these sessions revealed how differently we were coping. Diane wanted to move to a different state and never speak about the incident again, while I felt compelled to ensure Rebecca received the maximum possible prison sentence to protect other children from similar situations. Our disagreement about coping strategies strained our co-parenting relationship, which had been functional if distant since our divorce 2 years earlier, and we ended up in mediation to establish protocols for discussing the incident around Emma. The mediator helped us understand that we were both experiencing valid trauma responses and needed to respect each other's processing methods while maintaining consistency for Emma's benefit. We agreed not to discuss the legal case details around Emma and to use the same language when she asked questions about what happened, presenting a united front of safety and protection. Rebecca's trial began exactly 6 months after the hostage situation, and the courtroom was packed with parents from the graduation, media representatives, and spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Rebecca's premeditation, including the journals, the fake fire marshal documents she'd forged to install the chemical system, and testimony from the maintenance workers about her recruitment process. They brought in experts who explained how the FM 200 system would have affected the children's respiratory systems, confirming that 3 minutes of exposure would have caused permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation in victims as young as 4 years old. Rebecca's defense attorney tried to present her as a victim of systematic educational failures, who'd been driven to desperation by years of injustice, and who'd never actually intended to harm anyone, only to force accountability. The prosecution destroyed this argument by playing audio recordings from the negotiation calls, where Rebecca explicitly threatened to trigger the chemical release if her demands weren't met, proving she'd been willing to follow through with child endangerment. The jury heard testimony from Margaret Willis describing how Rebecca's employment termination had followed standard school board procedures and had been based on multiple documented complaints about inappropriate discipline methods, contradicting Rebecca's narrative of unjust persecution. Parent testimony painted a devastating picture of the terror their children had experienced and the ongoing psychological treatment required for recovery. I testified, on the fourth day of the trial, describing Emma's nightmares and behavioral changes and the way the hostage situation had stolen her trust in schools and authority figures right before she was supposed to start kindergarten. I told the jury about holding Emma's hand through the seats while Rebecca threatened to poison everyone and feeling completely helpless to protect my daughter from someone who'd planned to hurt children as a method of settling a workplace grievance. The defense called Rebecca to testify in her own defense, and she spent 3 days on the stand explaining her decade of struggle after being fired, and how she'd felt erased and ignored by everyone who'd destroyed her career. She cried while describing her divorce and her financial hardship and her sense that nobody cared about the injustice she'd experienced. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, forcing Rebecca to acknowledge that 43 4-year-olds and their parents had nothing to do with her. Employment termination and that terrorizing children was an objectively wrong response to workplace grievance. When asked directly if she would have pressed the button to release the chemical if Margaret hadn't arrived with an apology, Rebecca hesitated before saying she didn't know, which the prosecutor highlighted as evidence that she'd placed her desire for revenge above children's safety. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all major charges, including kidnapping, child endangerment, attempted assault with a deadly weapon, and terroristic threatening. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later and ordered a pre-sentencing psychological evaluation. Diane and I attended the sentencing hearing with written victim impact statements, and I read mine directly to Rebecca, explaining how she'd destroyed my daughter's sense of safety in the world and created trauma that would follow Emma for decades. I told her that whatever injustice she'd experienced from the school board paled in comparison to the injustice she'd inflicted on 43 innocent children who'd done nothing wrong. Rebecca cried throughout all the victim statements, 23 parents delivering accounts of their children's nightmares and therapy needs and behavioral changes. The judge delivered a harsh sentence, 32 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years, calling Rebecca's actions a calculated assault on the most vulnerable members of society disguised as social justice. The judge noted that Rebecca's education and planning made her actions more reprehensible rather than less, because she'd had the intelligence and time to recognize how wrong her plan was and had chosen to proceed anyway. 5 years have passed since Emma's preschool graduation turned into a hostage situation that lasted 45 minutes but changed our lives permanently. Emma is 9 now and in 3rd grade, and she still sees a therapist monthly to process residual anxiety about school situations and authority figures. She refuses to participate in graduation ceremonies of any kind, even though her elementary school assures us that security measures have improved. Diane and I rebuilt our co-parenting relationship into something stronger through shared trauma and therapy, though we never remarried. We attend support group meetings for families affected by hostage situations, a surprisingly large community of people whose normal activities were interrupted by violence. Emma knows the full story now, age-appropriate version, explaining that Ms. Thornton was hurt by something that happened at work and made very bad choices about how to respond to that hurt. We've taught her about processing anger in healthy ways and how injustice doesn't justify hurting innocent people. She's a thoughtful, cautious child who questions authority more than other kids her age, which her teachers find challenging, but which I see as a reasonable response to learning that trusted adults can be dangerous. Rebecca remains in prison and will be there until Emma is 29 years old, and I hope she spends every day of that sentence thinking about the 43 children she traumatized for her personal vendetta. Margaret Willis retired from the school board immediately after the trial and now volunteers with organizations supporting victims of workplace discrimination, trying to channel her guilt into productive action. The Sunshine Valley Preschool closed permanently 6 months after the incident, unable to recover from the negative publicity and parent trust violations. Emma's graduation cap still sits in a box in our attic, a reminder of how quickly celebration can transform into crisis, and how a 45-minute hostage situation taught us that security exists only as long as the people in authority choose to protect rather than harm the vulnerable. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.